and welcome to the Life Made Mobile podcast from Oracle, a conversation about the world of digital culture, digital strategy, mobile, data, and emerging tech. We speak to a range of interesting industry insiders or just get together to discuss some interesting stories from the world of technology and digital innovation. For those of you who don't know, Oracle are a software development agency that makes lives better with mobile technologies. Our talented teams partner with financial services and digital health clients on multi-year programs of work to design, build, launch, and iterate the next generation of digital business solutions. My name is Blair Walker, and alongside my colleague David Lowe, we'll be your hosts. And the biggest thing for today, podcast 5, is to try and stick to 30 minutes. Every time we say it, every time we miss it by 10 minutes. Do you think we can do it today, David?
I doubt it, but we'll give it a shot.
Well, yeah, we've oriented ourselves for success by only having 2 topics to discuss this week, and so if we don't come in underneath it, we're failing somewhat. So we'll get straight to it. So I'll propose that we speak first about the news that came in last week that Facebook is not only doubling down on the idea of building but being a metaverse company, and they're also planning to potentially change their parent company name to reflect this, which some insiders suggest might be coming out today or over the next 2 to 3 days. Before discussing this, I suppose we should probably start by explaining what the term metaverse means for the uninitiated. I mean, it's a term that comes from science fiction, I believe, originally. But it's a term that nowadays is broadly used to describe a computer-generated reality that you interact with in parallel to your physical or real life. So an extension of your day-to-day living that's in a computer-generated reality. So people's heads, when you say metaverse, tend to always go to, us all sitting at home with VR headsets on and not paying attention to the real physical world anymore. And I suppose lots of people's heads go to kind of open environment gaming. But in lots of ways, I suppose the metaverse is just any sort of internet facilitated, computer-based relationships, community existence. So me being in North Berwick, David being in Perth, we could argue that we're creating our own little metaverse together through Zoom. I don't know if that's actually correct, but hey-ho. So with that brief overview out of the way, what do you think to this, David? Is it a calculated move based on kind of the cultural zeitgeist and the direction of travel for technology, or is it a cynical land grab for more ad inventory?
It's probably both, right? Or they wouldn't be allowed to do it. I think, thinking about this before, Facebook will always run out of road eventually. Their business is built on the next billion all the time, and there's only certain numbers of extra billions they can find. So they have to try and embed themselves and go back to the original people that use Facebook regularly to stay in it. I think I looked up Zuckerberg's definition of the metaverse to try and get myself started. So he says, think about the metaverse as an embodied internet where instead of just viewing content, you are in it. I think Facebook, it lives on its measurements of retention and usage. So if you look back through Facebook's history, they've had to redefine how they measure themselves from monthly active to daily active to hourly active because the engagement got so much deeper. And you can see it's always been their trajectory. And the new people they bring in, they try and deepen that. And it has effects, as we've all discussed in the past, that they do it in certain ways to encourage people to do certain things. It just seems to me there is a zeitgeist thing, and there's also a technology thing that they've hit a point where they need to engage people more deeply with things that maybe aren't humans necessarily and other Facebook users. It might be other devices, it might be locations. I think the word ambience come into our talks the last few weeks and months especially. And the point about people living in that world as opposed to just watching it is the important thing. And I'm not sure Facebook in the end will be the winner of this, but in a way it's good that they are going first. This is a bit of a ramble trying to explain how I think about all of this stuff. But I had somebody that got married in Second Life, a friend of mine years ago.
Oh, really?
Who then got married to the same person in real life. shortly after. So you've seen some of this play out in different ways. I just don't see Facebook's thing as being like that. I think it's more like if Facebook get their way, something more akin to your GP being in a metaverse, and you speak to the GP in ways that you maybe aren't doing intentionally or proactively, but you're living in a world where the GP knows enough about you to keep an eye on you, and vice versa.
Yep.
I think it's more about connecting things in a useful way by utilizing that graph Facebook's built up over the years of people, locations, and interests that lets them do it. And as I say, they might not be the best people to enable this, but if they prove it can be done, that's not a bad start.
Interesting. So I think it was in our last podcast we were chatting about Apple, and you were mentioning about how lots of people think about Apple as a consumer product company, but actually in some ways they're a hardware company, and in some respects I suppose a chip company. And we've seen Google just release a new Pixel with its own chip for the first time. And so do you think as sort of Apple and Google head in sort of slightly different directions with their sort of not core offering, but they start to kind of allude to other interests, it's almost incumbent upon other big tech players to do the same, and to kind of choose a niche to try and make their own?
Possibly. I mean, one of the interesting things Facebook sort of announced was that for this to work for them, it would have to be interoperable with other things. I mean, they don't have a chance in hell of creating a physical network of things, and nor should they, because it exists elsewhere. What they are up against is people like Apple redefining what privacy is and what data collection is, because Apple thinks that collecting data on their phones is private, even if they get access to it. Google is going another way and actually doing machine learning on phones, which is about distributing technology in the cheapest way and not having to do it in the cloud, so that the privacy doesn't matter. Facebook needs to sit on top of that. So again, it's quite good that they're going first and trying to define what this is. And the value for them is the graph, which has never been a physical thing. It's based on definitions of physical things, but the connections between them are entirely ambient, as we keep saying. So I think I cannot see any other company, barring possibly Microsoft, funnily enough, having the ability to connect something like this in the way Facebook's able to at scale. The only other thing that gets near rivaling this is LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that if you look at the politics between all these companies, Microsoft gets on with everyone. It just has to. It's not because it's lost the race. It's how they operate nowadays. And LinkedIn, because it's based on Microsoft and mountains of work connections and ultimately person connections, is probably the only thing approaching the Facebook graph in a rich network of people and things and possibly events that get near to it. So that might be the competition. But for people that are going, and Apple going into hardware is a good example of this, that they know their path for money is to go down the hardware route and improve their margins and spread the devices and so on. And Google's starting to go the same way. Everything else has to live above that. And Facebook and I say LinkedIn are possibly the only things with scale that have a chance.
It's interesting. And a lot of the sort of buzz around the metaverse has, I suppose, been quite intimately related to the world of crypto and especially NFTs. A lot of the sort of initial brand plays in non-fungible tokens were related to items which could be worn or shown off within games like Decentraland, which are sort of metaverse games. And I suppose that I've seen a few sort of cultural commentators mentioning that Facebook obviously spoke about DM being their cryptocurrency at one point. They have partnered recently with Coinbase, and they've already explained that they're starting to look at how they might interact with non-fungible tokens, and then now they're saying, "Oh, we're going to have 10,000 people in Europe working on metaverse," and you wonder if they see it as so NFTs will inevitably move out of just the sort of meme culture and the sort of nascent cryptocurrency space into the sort of big brand space, and they want potentially to have I don't know, first dibs on the environment in which NFTs fuel things like customer relationship management, this was engagement with brands and businesses. I mean, there's an interesting company called Dematerialized who I just was looking into last week, and they are partnering with fashion brands to create fashion NFTs, which it has an AR app where when you purchase the NFT, you can then get someone to hold up your phone and you can wear the garment that you've just bought as a non-fungible token. And I mean, where that, if you buy a Gucci shirt, the sign value that you're essentially purchasing, the ability to be able to say, I'm wealthy enough to own a Gucci shirt, has always been demonstrated in nightclubs, in social settings and the like. And I suppose the idea is that that same sign value will have to be capitalized on in a digital second life as well.
I think that's true. And I think that as people grow up, and we've got kids that have come through things like Minecraft and whatever else it might be, and games that have been built on the notion that there's a world inside it that you keep improving. I mean, kids buy things in even in basic things like Roblox, you're essentially buying into brands as an app store within a game. And people have grown up with that notion that it's just what they do. And it's a bit alien to people in my age, I must admit. But human instincts don't change. If something is a brand of value, I'm willing to bet that's, because I'm not a user of it, that's what's happening in TikTok and platforms like that, and Snapchat before it, that it's a way for people to expose their like for a brand, and the whole influencer culture has come from that. I would imagine the next step from that is some sort of ambient world where people demonstrate their preferences in life and discover more. And if Facebook is trying to be that, given what it's learned from Instagram and creating this whole graph of how to influence and sell things, it wouldn't be a surprise if they just keep taking it steps further, that your entire life is based around that. But I do get back to thinking it's more about a connection of people's interests joined together in a way that they don't necessarily have to knowingly interact. Like, things are going on because you are connected to other things, not because you're choosing to. And I just wonder about the sort of network effects of how Facebook works. If you like someone, do you automatically identify that they are a Trump voter? If you're friends with someone, I've defriended people on Facebook because they went on and on about the SNP, and whatever my politics are, I'll go and find it myself. But am I seen in that graph as identified with these other people and things?
Yeah.
And I do worry about my connections on things, and I pared back LinkedIn because I didn't like being identified to people I just don't really know. And because people start to say, you know him, what do you think about that? And I really didn't. So I do start to worry about how it all unfolds and how we're seen as people in that metaverse by being connected to too much.
Yeah.
It's something I've spent the last 3 or 4 years worrying about, paring back, having been an early diver into things like Facebook and having probably thousands of friends, having almost none. I do wonder how far people think about these things and how much Facebook actually wants them to.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned the idea of being in content as a sort of a framing for Zuckerberg's point of view. I remember a conversation that I listened to with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who, whilst being an actor, has had a bit of a track and invested in tech startups, and was a very early YouTuber, I think, as well. I remember him saying that when he was asked about film and TV and the future of storytelling, as he said, he felt like immersive gaming was going to be the future of storytelling, and that there's only so much that we can do with the medium in this kind of like object subject type relationship where you're not part of it. And you wonder if entertainment is inviting people into that immersive experience to a certain extent, or the future of entertainment might be.
You wonder, have you ever seen the film version of Fahrenheit 451?
I have not, no.
there's elements of this in it where people sit in their house and their entire life is based around being part of the family being the government in that case. And all they do is be drugged up and watch government one-way television. And at a point in the film, they make out that one of the characters is part of a play in the TV show they're watching as part of the family, and interact with it, not knowing that everybody's doing the same thing. And the questions she's being asked don't have a right or wrong answer, but she feels drugged up as if she's part of that TV show, and her friends watch and think she's part of it, so they're getting their turn next and all that, whilst her husband is realizing the physical world still exists because he reads books that are supposed to be burned. I'm sure you know the story in high level terms. It feels a bit like that to an extent. There'll be some people who are in it and are sucked into it and can't leave it. Ultimately, that's how things go. And there'll be some that just never get that far or try and find a way to escape. And that's from the 60s. That story. I always find it amazing. We are seen as futurists of a kind when we're having these chats, but for people to think this stuff through 60 years ago is something else that I can't quite get my head around.
Oh no, absolutely. So picking up on the point that I just made about the idea that Facebook are going to find 10,000 people to work on metaverse work in Europe. The second point I wanted to chat to you about today was I had numerous conversations over the last few weeks with friends in digital, regardless of whether it's IT, infrastructure, software development, service design, product, marketing. Everyone seems to be struggling to find people at the moment. And we've spoken about it. It seems like it's an incredibly buoyant market for jobs, but there just isn't enough candidates to fill the roles. Do you feel like there's identifiable reasons as to why there seems to be a skills shortage or not enough people to fulfill the roles? And do you think that actually it's a confluence of a range of factors that probably we've been somewhat ignoring and been asleep at the wheel?
No, I think it's deliberate. And I think you can almost map out how it happened and how it's going to continue to happen. I'll try and keep this brief because I know I sometimes just wonder. But the technology world, especially developing products, has always been done one of two ways. It's either been done in an industrial fashion where you try and use factory technologies, whether it be Kanban developed from Japanese car plants and things like that, or forms of Agile, which really are about software, but they're ultimately about a step-by-step process of iteration, or you wing it. And you wing it from very small steps and find your way out. And neither of those are wrong, fundamentally wrong. But in the last, I'm going to say 10 years, it's probably slightly longer, but 10 years, there's been a culture that the industrial version comes into play as the one that's less risky. And as people are starting to invest much more in tech, as opposed to other things, they want to be investing in things that are less risky and more visible about the potential of success. And what that means on the ground is where you might have had one engineer doing a thing, testing it, a webmaster, it might have been called 30 years ago nearly. You now have disciplines. Design's gone down this road for years. A designer is now many things, and quite rightly, because they were all disciplines that one person might have done. But now they have so much value and seem to have value as part of an industrial process, you need more of them. So you go from one techie person to design development, project management, product management, which really has only come into a thing the last 10 years in the tech world. It was there at places like Microsoft, but not in a two-man startup. It grows exponentially. The more of these things you do, the next company sees that they have to do them. Then the public sector realizes they can de-risk and speed up, frankly, the things they're doing by adding more people to it. And as that culture builds, people who are in these jobs will go to one that expects to behave that way, where they might have been in a small company, taking risks, having fun. They go to somewhere where they actually get things done stably and in more of an organized fashion. So I think that's been a thing. And the more you see of it, people talk to each other, they go to meetups, they go to conferences. It's being fed to everyone. This is the way to work now, to make sure you're going to get something people want, love, use, whatever it might be. And it's just recognized that having lots of people is the answer. And it isn't fundamentally, it's what they do is the answer. But in certainly, we've seen it in the tech ecosystem in Scotland, how a couple of companies sprung up to be unicorns, as it were, and they sucked in hundreds of people in quite a short space. Then people around them say, right, we see what they're doing. Let's do it the same way. So where we might have hired one, we're going to need 10. So they get investors, and the investors understand it, and off it goes. And it's kind of out of control now. Not that you maybe want it to be, but people are going to hire more people because they've seen why it's necessary or why it's something to do. And there's no getting away from the fact the world wasn't ready for that. You know, schools aren't chucking out people that are going to walk into an agile world, or they weren't. They probably are now, that come into that knowing what to do. So for a while, the people who were in it have transformed themselves. I know people that were in non-tech jobs 10 years ago. They're now deeply in tech and understand process, agile, the benefit, measurement, data, where they might have been in marketing 10 years ago, and an old school drawing things for people, design, for example. And it doesn't end now. It's only going to keep growing. And the more we talk about Facebook hiring 10,000 people out of nowhere, that distorts everybody's markets. It's never going to end. And yeah, it's a problem.
And interestingly, I suppose, and as that job market grows, it seems that the benchmarks for what you should expect to pay for a graduate, or for someone with like up to 5 years experience, or someone with 10 to 15 years experience, is just going through the roof. I heard Chamath Palihapitiya the other day saying that in Silicon Valley, you know, an engineer coming out of a good school, you know, 10 years ago could have expected to earn probably between 65 and 85K US dollars. And he said that nowadays they're all earning north of 200,000 US dollars. And certainly from experience and speaking to people, I've heard a lot of like really in demand roles, you know, especially in data, you know, like really hardcore data science roles, you know, commanding huge salaries, you know, the kind of ones that just would erode profit margins for most organizations. And how do we level those two things? There's more of those jobs, but we have to pay even more? Or do you think that as the market grows, then those high salaries come down because there's a bigger pool, and so you know, that kind of balances itself out over time?
It will ultimately. These things go in cycles. If you went back to when I studied, accountancy and law were the things to do, because ultimately there's no end of need for lawyers. Accountancy was spreading into different disciplines. It's a very similar story. You could choose whether to be in audit or governance, and accountancy was teaching people HR as part of the exams and all that sort of thing. And accountants became prevalent. Ultimately, I'm led to believe, because I'm not close to it anymore, but these professions aren't as well paid as they used to be, because there's no end of people coming out of university with broad qualifications in those sectors. It will go that way, but that's taken 2 decades to get that far. In tech, there's a combination of things will get us there, from people realizing they need to cross skill one way or the other. Don't know about you, I'm self-taught and found my way into it because there was nowhere else to go.
Exactly.
Unless you could find your way into uni and afford to do it, which I couldn't. I just sat at night for weeks and months on end and figured it out. Now you have things like code academies. There are several in the UK. Scotland's got a very prominent one in Code Clan, which is very good. Places that will employ people coming out of those code academies, which is really important. Code Base in Edinburgh, which is next door, sucks in a lot of the graduates. As the companies grow, that needs an investment landscape to fund the companies. So it's an ecosystem of things that will get us there. And then those people will spill out into other companies, banks or whoever that have the money and can't find the people. But it'll take a long time. And we're going the right way. I know we don't speak for Scotland in particular, but on the doorstep, we can see there's money going into things to get people interested, to get them early, whether it be at school or a career change point or something, to bring them in and teach them the basics and pull people into that ecosystem. But it will take an awful long time. To your question at the other end, I remember, I think it's 2014, Skyscanner were looking for graduates at the time, but a very good graduate program. We had one person who was the rock star coming out of Cambridge that we were looking at. They were looking for £1 million.
Really?
Then. Now that was their 4-year. This is a US thing, but it was their 4-year comp. So 250 over 4 years as the baseline. Some of that would be shares, which grow. So if your shares double every year, you're probably talking 1.5 over the 4 years. That was then. And I think Facebook took it.
Wow.
Just to give, obviously, clearly wouldn't say who the person is, but that sort of auction was going on back then. For the right people, it must still go on.
Yeah.
I suspect the levels of that have actually got easier because there are more of these people coming through, but there will always be a distorted market for certain things, data, like you say just now, that go that way. And I've heard lately that sort of number isn't unusual for people of our sort of level and companies like Microsoft and so on. It wouldn't be unusual as a 4-year number to aim for that kind of compensation. Scary, isn't it?
And yeah, and I mean, the interesting thing I've always found about it is talking to your point about being self-taught and about cross-skilling and finding new things that you're interested in and learning them. The first agency that I worked for when I eventually managed to navigate my way into this world was Big Mouth Media. And at that time, there was the only stipulation for getting a foot into recruitment drive was you had to be university educated. And the first person that broke that mold was a chap that I was a colleague with for 6-7 years when I was there. And he did it because he was a high school graduate and he was so good at SEO, so good at technical SEO, that he was outranking sites that we were running for our clients. And he just did it by basically proving that he was better than everyone there. And so we eventually got him in, and he was just an unbelievable talent, just a total brain. But yeah, he had come out from high school and had no interest in going to uni. And you wonder how much of, if you go to a high school in a nice area, your parents, and even in this generation, will still somehow see success within the realms of like, did you get good grades, get into a good university, and are you doing a good subject at a good university? And I've heard it said numerous times that people still want their kids to go into health and law. I mean, at this point, I just see that as borderline ludicrous in some respects.
I agree. I'm going through this slightly at home at the minute. My son's 13, so he's about to start having to make choices for third year at school for which way to go. And the chat is still being directed as, I know we've gone through the no wrong path stuff every year when people do their exams, and it'll work out if you wanted to, but there are still gates that people have to go through. So he's now saying to himself, without really knowing any better, should I do physics or something else? And things like that. And it's being drummed in that he's got a vague idea of what he might like to do. So, right, you must do physics and maths. And that's not a bad shout for anyone, to be perfectly honest. But what if he doesn't enjoy them? And I went through years of doing accountancy and law and stuff and didn't enjoy it and got myself out. But people shouldn't have to be boxed in like that in the first place, I don't think. And to your other point, meritocracy goes an awful long way.
Yeah,
I think a great believer in it. I know a friend of mine went into the FT years ago, and he had an intern, I think, who knew what he was doing, but no qualifications. He was making the tea and stuff. Something broke overnight on the night shift. And like within months, he was CTO of that division because they just said, right, you're it. And they let him through once he'd sort of learned the corporate stuff. And yeah, there's a lot to be said for that.
Well, yeah, and I suppose the beauty of promoting from within is that you create meaning and value in the community and the culture that you grow up in. The difficulty, I suppose, sometimes if people are brought in above you when you feel like you could do a job, is that sometimes that will pique people's interest when the next recruitment agent comes to them on LinkedIn and says, interested in this, so it's like that meaning making within an organization or within a team is so important as well, in terms of like making you feel like what you're doing on a day-to-day basis is valuable.
I think so. I've got 2 rules in work and life, and I say them to anybody that asks, but never ask somebody to do something you couldn't and wouldn't do yourself. And if they do it better than you, then let them through. It's kind of like a golfing thing. and if you know the parlance, like if you're playing golf and you're slow and dreadful and there's somebody decent behind you, the etiquette is you do let them through. And that's the analogy. You let them pass, then you plod on and do your own thing and they race away. That's how it should be. I've never thought any different about anything, whether it's tech or any other form of work. It's just how it should be.
Yeah, I really enjoyed, there was a quote in the Phil Knight book Shoe Dog about the sort of formative years of Nike, where he was saying, don't tell people how to do something, tell them what you want them to do and let them surprise you, which I thought was quite a good thing. And certainly, like my first boss, I remember I was in a sort of web analytics and data team, and he just used to set me challenges for things that he knew I couldn't do, to see if I would go out and try and learn enough to give a version of it back to him. And that was so empowering for me, was he was just like, see how you do.
Yeah.
You know, and it was difficult because you were sort of like left out on your own. And you just kind of had to do something that you weren't comfortable doing. But oh God, what a learning experience.
I even like doing technical tests that way for hiring engineers and things like that. The one that was a really bad thing to do in hindsight, but to ask somebody to do a test with a broken computer. They didn't know that coming in. So they have an instant panic that the thing that should work doesn't, because the computer was borked deliberately before they got there. And for people to come through, fix the computer and finish the test, that was the one you wanted. And it might be 1 in 100 and you have to wait, but that's the devil's work. But the one person who came through that is now one of the best people I ever employed. He's a senior somewhere else, and it worked out. But yeah, you soon separate people out doing things like that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, we did our 2 topics, David, and I think we're at 32 minutes. So we've gone down from overrunning from 15 minutes, overrunning from 12 minutes, overrun 10 minutes. We're now it's 2. So I think we should be proud of ourselves. I mean, 2 big topics to discuss within 30 minutes. That's
you should plot a graph of this and publish it online somewhere.
Oh no, exactly. We'll just work on becoming more succinct. What that's the difficulty though, is you need to do lots of research to be succinct, and right. We don't have enough time to do lots.
What was it Mark Twain said? It takes him 3 weeks to be spontaneous. I think that's just about right.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time again, David. And to everyone listening, if you want to find out more about Waracle and what we do, we're at waracle.com or on our social channels, which are either at Waracle or at Waracle UK. But until episode 6, thank you so much for joining us, and we will hear from you, and you will hear from us again soon.